So a few more words on the Sitka spruce. And we started out by looking at the Sitka spruce in this area just south of Cascade Head. I want to also draw your attention to some interesting material in it in a book, and I'm going to give you guys some access to some of this stuff. I'm still trying to figure out quite how to manage that, so I'll give you an update. But just a few things kind of visually and also in other aspects of Sitka spruce. One, remember, it's largely a coastal tree, and it does extend all the way up into Alaska from southern Oregon and even California fog belt. A little bit in California. It's in that way kind of similar to where some of the redwoods would be if you were in extreme southern Oregon and in Northern California. Um, but a few things to notice. You probably, if you've traveled on the coast at all or you've seen postcards, this kind of classic look here of the shoreline Sitka spruce growing on, these rocks and kind of at all against all odds, they manage to sort of hang on. And these are kind of places where you might get 100-mile-an-hour wind gusts in the winter. Not unusual at all. The salt spray, the crashing waves. So they're very hardy trees and they do dominate in this area largely because of that hardiness in that very severe environment. And in that sense, there's never really a true climax tree because there's always so much disturbance. But they certainly are numerically dominant in most of these kind of rugged coastline areas, such as what I'm showing here. And then when you have these sea stacks, you'll see some of them growing up in those areas as well. Kind of the classic form. There's a lot of these up like by Tillamook Head, for example. You could see these. Um, and you can like 200,000 seeds for a pound. Very, very small seeds. They go great distances. Here's another one, this kind of, classic. This would be like at the top, kind of like some of the coastal hills, little meadows that you can find. In fact, there's one just north of Lincoln City where you can see trees just like this with that kind of skeletal look there, just showing the effects of the wind on how the tree itself actually grows on the coastal headland. And then the classic burls that you can see growing as well. Sometimes the burls are far larger in diameter than the trunk itself. So anyway, those are a few things I thought you might enjoy about learning about the Sitka spruce. They were a very important tree during World Wars One and Two for aircraft. Even in some ways considered better than using metal frames because you could do it so quickly. So a lot of the coastal forests were heavily logged during that time period. So going back to our outline then, what grows where in the coastal forest? So we talked about the seral species and then the climax ones. And so the key concept is that the western hemlock and the western red cedar are generally not abundant at the seral stage. They don't grow very well, we said, in the extreme kind of sunshine, very intense sunshine without very much shade kind of environment, even at the coast because the summers are so dry. But they can be dominant over long time frames if there's no major disturbance. We said that was because of the shade canopy. They're very good at growing up. These two trees are very good at growing up in pretty extreme shade, better so even than the Sitka spruce, which is somewhat shade tolerant. So what happens then in this environment is that eventually, though, if you have, especially just in a little bit from the coast, right in the immediate beach areas and headlands, you'll get a dominant western hemlock or western red cedar, especially in swampy areas for the red cedar, when there's extreme shade. So, in fact, kind of an interesting saying about the western hemlock is that the meek shall inherit the earth, and those of you who have a background in Christianity would probably recognize that one. This is a tree that doesn't seem aggressive. It doesn't start out aggressive, but because it can grow with so little sunshine, it can sprout up in nurse logs and other habitats where it can gain some foothold and roots. and it can grow up in just very, very modest amounts of solar radiation, just waiting for the day when there's a major tree fall around. And by then, maybe this tree is 20, 30 feet tall, and that's its great opportunity. And it takes off once it has that light. It's already got a great advantage, and they do grow in stands, and they will shade out anything else. So they grow up in the shade, and they eventually become dominant in some stands. Florence, Oregon, kind of south part of the Central Coast. There's some really amazing western hemlock stands very close to the beach. As also, there's some red cedar ones down in swamper areas. So you can see these, and both of these are very good at growing up in the shade. Um, Now, just a moment on coastal redwoods. We do have a few in southern Oregon, Chetco River area south. Of course, the classic is central to northern California coast where you see these, and they're known for their size, their fire and flood resistance, their insect resistance, and so on. And they're a fast grower as well, and so they compete with some of the other trees in that area, such as Douglas fir, and also tan oak, which, by the way, is a madrone tertiary plant as well. They kind of look like the Pacific madrone, but you don't see them so much on the Oregon coast until you get farther south, interior areas. But you see those a lot in Northern California, growing right with redwoods. And in fact, the people growing that are foresters with coastal redwoods will often go and thin out the tan oak in those areas. So that's just a little bit about the coastal redwoods. I won't make an emphasis on them. And they certainly are a Pacific Northwest tree if you want to include a little bit of Southern Oregon and Northern California in your definition of the region. And they do thrive in that coastal fog belt as well. All right. So if we go up in the higher elevations of the coastal forest, you see a lot of the same players, but also noble fir, mountain hemlock, and subalpine fir and lodgepole pine are added in. And they're more high elevation, cooler climate kinds of trees. I'm not going to give you specific detail on any of these trees, other than just to mention that you get a different composition. The noble fir is one that you've seen, you know those from Christmas tree. That time of year, those in Douglas fir are roughly equivalent in sales during the holiday season for trees. So in the interior highlands, and by that I mean, say, the east slope of the Cascades, Western Rockies, and so on. In fact, let's go have a look at that. I'm just trying to find let's see. This is your Pacific Northwest Atlas, and I'm saving it in the Moodle section so you can get this. This is a look at the vegetation zones in the kind of strict Washington, Oregon, Idaho context, if you like that as a region. I think that the geographers down at Oregon State University years ago, when they put this together, mainly had better data for those three states. And it was kind of simple because then, how much of Montana's data do you include, or Northern California, or British Columbia, and so on. So they just kept it in the U.S., and that's fine. But it does kind of limit us. There's nothing really much different just going slightly north of the border. For example, you run into the same story really in much of anything you want to study geographically, and the same for Northern California, Southern Oregon. But in any case, so you got this narrow strip of what's called the Sitka Spruce zone. You can see down here if you've got a large enough screen. If not, I'm just kind of highlighting it. This is the Sitka Spruce zone. So that's that immediate coastal area. But then transitioning, you'll see the Western Hemlock zone is just inside of that. Right there, that's this blue color. And so those zones aren't all that different, except you just don't see as many spruce in the interior here. And then what I just mentioned, the interior highlands area in our notes. And so you've got quite a few places where you have these interior highlands. East slope of the Cascades, the Western Rockies. So going back again to this. So this would be the slopes of the Rockies over on this side largely, and going a little bit farther north up here in northern Idaho. And then the east side as well. So you see these kind of zones that are generally somewhat on the drier side, although not necessarily all of them. And so in our notes, Grand Fir and Douglas fir are dominant in the more humid or highlands. And in the drier areas, usually a little lower, although not always, but in particular landscape, almost always lower. Ponderosa pine, which are often a kind of climax tree type, but very fire resistant. We're going to talk about that fire question quite a bit in detail later. And also western junipers in the lower elevations or dried tree zones. And just to give you a sense of these now, let's go. Let's see. I'm not seeing those here. I'm going to pause for just a moment. So, in looking at these interior highlands, whether it's the east slope of the Cascades, areas like sloping down in, for example, Bend, Oregon, or in the state of Washington, we would be talking about going down into, say, Ellensburg through the Cle Elum Valley, and so on. Sun River, some of these areas, Oregon as well. You have grand fir and Douglas fir dominant in most of these humid or higher lands. You often see ponderosa pine in these areas, and as we mentioned, the junipers in somewhat lower elevations and drier. And then there's also the western larch. So let's look at some of these now a little bit. This is a kind of classic ponderosa pine look. The bark kind of tells you, and then also the needles stick out. And this is a kind of park-like setting here where it can you can see them this way. This is usually possible in areas where there's been some every 5 to 10 years some ground fires, maybe intentionally to manage that. And Native American times that was the case in much of the pine forest areas. So you have this kind of park-like look, classic. In the early days of the horse with Native Americans, they would run and use them and hunting through there. You can go full speed ahead through these kinds of areas without any brush. And then you'd have also in these, on the drier end of things, you have the kind of classic western juniper look. So this is, Redmond, Oregon. About as many of these there as anywhere else, but through much of the interior region, some in Washington State, and definitely in much of the drier part of Oregon, kind of just drier a little beyond the ponderosa pine, you see these dominate. And in fact, they've kind of taken over much of the region. We're going to look at that story later on as well. But what I also want to show you then is a kind of classic setting of ponderosa pine. Look at this. This is one of my favorite places in Central Oregon, kind of on the east slope of the Cascades. This is going up from Sisters, Oregon, up toward the McKenzie Pass. So it's McKenzie Highway right out of Sisters, just headed west, going up the mountain gradually. And that's kind of classical ponderosa pine forest. And then also you can see in these areas, let's see, I was looking for my other photos. One of the kind of settings of great interest for what we're doing in this class, this whole question of succession, you can get a sense of this when you look at this photo. There's two trees. This is a grand fir, and I haven't showed you a grand fir, by the way. So here's one, and the kind of the flattened needles. There's a couple of variations of it, and they hybridize some with white fir. And a close look, I think that's actually a hybridized one there. But in any case, what's going on there? Who looks happier? This little ponderosa pine here with the long needles and just a few needles really sticking out. Can't really even see that side very well. Or this fir, which one, this grand fir, which one are you going to bet on in the long haul? See, this is a shaded environment. The key to understanding this is the ponderosa pine doesn't grow well in the shade, up in the shade. So where you get a nice stand of trees, they're at a great disadvantage, okay? And so we're going to pick up that story in our next slide, this sort of successional story. So grand fir, that's the one that's probably going to win the day here.